The buzzards circled overhead like harbingers of death, their shadows dancing across the cracked earth where Ayana lay bleeding. Her wrists, raw from the ropes that had bound her to the twisted mesquite tree, told the story of her betrayal sold by her own tribe's war chief to the white settlers as a peace offering, then abandoned when negotiations failed. Josiah Brennan's horse snorted nervously as he approached the still form. 28 years of cowpunching had taught him to recognize death from a distance, but something about the gentle rise and fall of the woman's chest made him dismount with unusual haste. Her skin, the color of burnished copper, bore the telltale marks of dehydration and exposure, yet her beauty remained unmarred by suffering. "Easy there, miss," he whispered, kneeling beside her. His calloused hands worked quickly to free her from the remaining rope fragments. When her eyes fluttered, open dark as midnight and fierce as a wildcat's, Josiah felt something shift deep in his chest. She spoke in her native tongue, words flowing like water over stones. Though he couldn't understand her language, the defiance in her voice was unmistakable. This was no broken spirit. This was a warrior temporarily fallen. "Water," he said, reaching for his canteen. "You need water." Ayana tried to push his hands away, but her strength had been sapped by 3 days without sustenance. The cool liquid touched her lips, and survival instinct overcame pride. She drank deeply, her eyes never leaving his face. Josiah studied her features, the high cheekbones that spoke of nobility, the full lips that even cracked and dry held an alluring curve, the way her long black hair spread across the sand like spilled ink. But it was her eyes that captured him. Despite her circumstances, they burned with an inner fire that reminded him of stars piercing through storm clouds. "Who did this to you?" he asked, though he suspected she couldn't understand his words. Ayana lifted a trembling hand and pointed toward the distant mountains. "Kinloch," she managed in broken English, the name bitter on her tongue. Josiah's jaw tightened. He knew the name well. Colonel Marcus Kinloch, a man who claimed to bring civilization to the territory, while leaving a trail of broken treaties and burned villages in his wake. The colonel had been negotiating with various tribes, using whatever method suited his purposes. "Can you ride?" Josiah asked, gesturing toward his horse. Ayana struggled to sit up, her pride warring with her body's weakness. She managed to nod, though the effort cost her dearly. As Josiah helped her to her feet, their bodies pressed close for a moment. The scent of her hair sage and wildflowers despite her ordeal filled his nostrils. When she stumbled, his arms instinctively encircled her waist, and for a heartbeat, the harsh desert seemed to fade away. "You're safe now," he murmured against her ear, surprising himself with the tenderness in his voice. "I won't let anyone hurt you again." Ayana looked up at him, and something passed between them, a recognition that transcended language and culture. This stranger had appeared like an answer to prayers he hadn't dared to voice. The ride back to Josiah's homestead tested both their endurance and resolve. Ayana sat behind him on the horse, her arms wrapped around his waist for stability, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing against her cheek. Each mile that passed brought color back to her face and strength back to her limbs, but also uncertainty about her fate. Josiah's cabin sat in a valley protected by red rock formations, a humble structure he'd built with his own hands after leaving his family's failed farm in Missouri. As they approached, Ayana noticed the careful way he'd positioned it near water, with clear sight lines in all directions and escape routes through the canyon walls. This man understood survival. "It ain't much," Josiah said as he helped her down from the horse, "but it's honest and it's mine." Inside, Ayana was surprised by the cleanliness and order. Books lined a rough-hewn shelf, and a violin case sat carefully placed on the mantel. This cowboy was more than he appeared. Josiah busied himself preparing food, stealing glances at his unexpected guest. Ayana had wrapped herself in one of his blankets, sitting by the fireplace as he heated beans and salt pork. The simple domesticity of the moment felt strangely intimate. "Tell me about Kinloch," he said, settling across from her with 2 plates. Ayana's face hardened. In halting English mixed with gestures, she explained how the colonel had approached her tribe with promises of peace and trade. Her father, Chief Running Bear, had been wary, but the winter had been harsh and their people were hungry. When Kinloch demanded a bride as surety for the treaty negotiations, the war chief, Stone Hawk, had seen an opportunity to rid himself of a rival for power. Stone Hawk. "He wants to be chief," she said, her accent making the words sound like music despite their harsh meaning. "He tells my father I am, how you say, sacrifice for peace. But when treaty talks fail, Kinloch leaves me to die. Shows he never wants peace." Josiah's hands clenched into fists. "And your father? He agreed to this?" Pain flickered across Ayana's features. "My father is old, sick. Stone Hawk speaks poison in his ear. Says I bring bad medicine because I learn white man's words from missionary woman." The irony wasn't lost. On either of them, her knowledge of English, gained despite tribal opposition, now allowed them to communicate and had likely saved her life. As night fell, Josiah prepared a bedroll for himself near the door while insisting Ayana take his bed. The gesture wasn't lost on her. This man was offering protection and respect, asking nothing in return. "Why you help me?" she asked as he banked the fire. Josiah paused, surprised by the question. In the flickering firelight, she looked like something from a painting, beautiful, mysterious, and utterly vulnerable despite her inner strength. "Maybe because you needed help and I was there," he said. "Maybe because I've been alone out here so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone need me. And maybe," he continued, the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, "because when I saw you lying there in the desert, something in my chest recognized something in yours." Ayana studied his face in the dim light. She'd been raised to distrust white men, taught that they spoke with forked tongues and took what they wanted by force. But this man's eyes held no deception, no hunger for conquest. Instead, she saw a loneliness that matched her own and a gentleness that contradicted his weathered exterior. "In my dreams," she whispered, "I see a man who saves me from darkness. His eyes are like sky after storm." Josiah's breath caught. "What color are his eyes in your dreams?" "Blue," she said, meeting his gaze. "Like yours." Dawn broke with the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Josiah was already awake, his hand on his rifle as he peered through the cabin's single window. 6 riders approached at a steady pace, and even at a distance, he recognized the military bearing of their leader. "Kinloch," he muttered, then turned to Ayana. "Stay inside. Keep low." Ayana rose from the bed, moving with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to danger. "I will not hide like frightened rabbit." "This ain't about courage," Josiah said firmly. "It's about staying alive long enough to see justice done." Colonel Marcus Kinloch dismounted with theatrical authority, his uniform pristine despite the desert travel. Behind him, 5 men formed a semicircle, not soldiers, but hired guns with the cold eyes of men comfortable with violence. "Brennan," Kinloch called out, "we're looking for stolen property. An Indian woman who escaped from our custody." Josiah stepped onto his porch, rifle held casually but ready. "I haven't stolen anything, Colonel. But I did find a woman left to die in the desert. Figured that was more cruelty than even you could stomach." Kinloch's face reddened. "That savage was given to us as part of treaty negotiations. When she refused to cooperate, discipline was necessary." "Discipline?" Josiah's voice carried the edge of barely controlled rage. "You tied her to a tree and left her for the buzzards. That ain't discipline, that's murder." "The girl belongs to us," Kinloch said, his hand moving to his sidearm. "Stand aside or be considered in violation of territorial law." "Whose law?" Josiah asked. "The kind that says you can treat human beings like livestock?" Inside the cabin, Ayanna listened to every word, her heart pounding. Through a gap in the logs, she could see the tension coiling like a spring about to snap. These men had come to take her back, to finish what they'd started in the desert. But she would not let Josiah die for her sake. Before anyone could react, she stepped through the door, chin held high despite wearing only Josiah's oversized shirt and her torn buckskin skirt. "I am here," she announced. "You want me, not him." Kinloch's eyes lit with cruel satisfaction. "There she is, boys. The Colonel's bride-to-be." "I was never your bride," Ayanna said, her English clearer than it had been the previous night. "Your treaty was lie. You never intended peace." "Peace?" Kinloch laughed harshly. "Peace is what happens when the savage learns to submit to civilization." Josiah stepped protectively in front of Ayanna, but she placed a gentle hand on his arm. "This must end," she whispered to him, "but not with your death." To Kinloch, she said louder, "I will come with you, but only if you give your word this man lives." "Ayanna, no," Josiah said urgently. "I won't let them take you." Kinloch considered the offer, his cruel smile widening. "The girl has sense, unlike certain cowpunchers who don't know their place." But as Kinloch's men began to advance, a new sound echoed across the valley, the thunder of many hooves. Josiah's eyes widened as he recognized the riders cresting the ridge. Running Bear, despite his age and illness, led a war party of 20 Navajo warriors, their faces painted for battle. "Seems your father found his backbone," Josiah murmured to Ayanna. Ayanna's breath caught. In the morning light, she could see her father's face clearly for the first time in moons. Gone was the confusion and weakness that Stonehawk had exploited. In its place was the iron will of a chief who discovered his daughter's true fate. "Colonel," Josiah said with grim satisfaction, "I believe you're about to learn the difference between a real treaty and a lie." The war party surrounded Kinloch's small group with practiced efficiency. Running Bear rode forward, his weathered face a mask of controlled fury. "You return my daughter," he said in perfect English, "or you die where you stand." Kinloch's hand twitched toward his gun, but the odds had shifted dramatically against him. The standoff stretched like a bowstring ready to snap. Kinloch's hired guns shifted nervously as they counted the warriors surrounding them, realizing they were outnumbered 4-1. The colonel himself maintained his arrogant facade, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Chief Running Bear," Kinloch said with false diplomacy, "surely we can resolve this misunderstanding." "Your war chief Stonehawk made the arrangement willingly." "Stonehawk speaks no longer for our people," Running Bear replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "When I learned he traded my daughter for promises you never meant to keep, his tongue was cut from his mouth." Ayanna gasped, not from shock at the punishment, but from relief at her father had seen through Stonehawk's deception. The old chief's eyes found hers across the tense circle of men and horses. "My daughter," he said in their native tongue. "I have been a fool, blinded by sickness and false counsel. Can you forgive an old man's weakness?" Before Ayanna could respond, one of Kinloch's men made a fatal mistake. Nervous and trigger-happy, he drew his pistol and fired at the nearest warrior. The shot went wide, but it shattered the fragile piece like glass. The battle erupted in chaos. Josiah threw himself against Ayanna, driving her to the ground behind the water trough as bullets and arrows flew overhead. Warriors whooped their battle cries while gunfire cracked across the valley like thunder. "Stay down," Josiah shouted, his rifle barking as he returned fire at one of Kinloch's men who was trying to flank their position. Ayanna watched her father fight with the skill of his youth. his lance finding its mark in the shoulder of a gunman. Despite his age, Running Bear moved like water flowing around rocks, avoiding bullets while closing distance with his enemies. Kinloch himself had taken cover behind his horse, firing wildly at the warriors who seemed to dance between his shots. His military training meant nothing against opponents who had learned warfare in the harsh school of survival. The battle turned decisively when two of Kinloch's hired guns broke ranks and tried to flee. Warriors cut off their escape, and the remaining gunmen found themselves back to back, firing their last rounds into an ever-tightening circle. Enough! Josiah roared, standing with his rifle aimed directly at Kinloch's chest. It's over, Colonel. Kinloch rose slowly, his face flushed with rage and humiliation. His remaining men lay dead or wounded around him, while not a single warrior had fallen. His grand plans for controlling the territory through fear and false treaties had collapsed in a matter of minutes. You think this changes anything? Kinloch snarled. The army will come. They'll burn your village and hang every warrior here. Running Bear dismounted and walked slowly toward the colonel, his weathered face serene despite the violence just ended. The army you speak of receives reports from their scouts. But what if those scouts tell them you were killed in an ambush by renegades? What if they never learn of this place or these people? The implication was clear. Kinloch could die here. His body left for the desert scavengers, and no one in the territorial capital would ever know the truth. His own arrogance and cruelty had led him far from backup or support. Ayanna rose from behind the trough, her eyes moving between her father and the man who had saved her life. Two worlds stood before her, the traditional path of her people and something new, unexpected and dangerous in its possibilities. There is another way, she said, stepping forward. Let him live, but blind to this valley's location. Send him back with a message that the treaties failed because of renegade actions. His pride will make him blame others rather than admit his defeat. Josiah looked at her with new appreciation. Even in the aftermath of violence, she thought like a strategist, seeking solutions that protected everyone she cared about. Wisdom from one so young, Running Bear mused. Perhaps my daughter has learned much from her time in both worlds. But Kinloch's eyes burned with hatred as they fixed on Ayanna. You savage bitch, you think? His words ended abruptly as Josiah's rifle butt connected with his jaw, dropping him unconscious to the dirt. Some men never learn respect, Josiah said quietly. Maybe a few days tied to his own tree will teach him some. 3 days later, Kinloch and his surviving men were released at the territorial border with a story carefully crafted to protect the valley. Stripped of their weapons and mounted on tired horses, they carried the message that renegade bands had disrupted treaty negotiations, forcing them to withdraw. The colonel's wounded pride ensured he would tell the story in a way that blamed others rather than admitting his own failures. But the resolution of immediate danger brought new complications. As Running Bear prepared to return to his village, the question of Ayanna's future hung unspoken in the desert air. You will come home now, daughter, the old chief said, but his words carried more hope than command. Ayanna looked between her father and Josiah, torn between worlds that seemed impossible to bridge. I cannot return as if nothing has changed. Father, Stonehawk's betrayal showed me that some in our tribe see me as a threat to tradition. And this man, she gestured toward Josiah, he risked everything to save me. Running Bear studied the cowboy who had protected his daughter. In the 3 days since the battle, he had watched Josiah carefully, noting the respect with which he treated Ayanna, the way his eyes followed her with protective concern rather than possessive hunger, and the manner in which he asked nothing of her while offering everything. You care for my daughter, Running Bear said to Josiah. It wasn't a question. Josiah removed his hat, meeting the chief's eyes directly. I care for her more than my own life, sir. But I won't claim her like property or ask her to abandon her people for mine. And if she chose to stay with you? What? Then? The question hung in the morning air like smoke from a sacred fire. Josiah felt his heart hammering against his ribs as he considered his answer. Then I'd spend every day proving worthy of that choice, he said finally. I'd learn her language, her customs. I'd protect her people as I'd protect her. And I'd love her with everything I have until my last breath. Ayanna felt tears threaten at the raw honesty in his voice. In the 3 days of recovery, she had watched this gentleman care for her with no expectation of reward. He had asked nothing, demanded nothing, simply offered safety and respect while she healed. But more than that, she had seen his loneliness match her own. Both of them existed between worlds, he, educated beyond most cowboys but choosing the solitary life of a rancher. She, caught between traditional ways and the changing world around them. Father, she said softly, I dream no longer of a faceless man with storm sky eyes. I know his name now, and his heart. Running Bear nodded slowly. The dreams your grandmother spoke of when you were small. She said you would find your path when the spirits brought you the right companion. But I cannot simply abandon our people. Ayanna continued. The missionary woman who taught me to read, she showed me how knowledge from both worlds can help our tribe. Perhaps that is my true purpose. An idea began forming in Josiah's mind. What if you didn't have to choose completely? What if we found a way to build bridges instead of walls? Both Ayanna and her father looked at him with interest. Your people need someone who understands both worlds, Josiah continued. Someone who can negotiate with territorial officials, read their documents, understand their laws. And the white settlers need someone who can teach them about the land, about living in harmony with it instead of fighting it. You speak of marriage. Between worlds, Running Bear mused, it would not be easy. Both sides would question such a union. I've never taken the easy path, Josiah said, his eyes finding Ayanna's. And I believe your daughter is strong enough to forge a new one. Ayanna stepped closer to Josiah, her hand finding his. In my vision dreams, I saw myself standing at the crossing of 2 rivers. I never understood what it meant until now. The crossing place is where new streams are born, Running Bear said with a smile that transformed his weathered features. Perhaps it is time for this old chief to become a grandfather to children who will know both worlds as home. The wedding took place as autumn painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson. It was a ceremony unlike any the territory had witnessed, blending Navajo traditions with frontier customs in a celebration that honored both cultures. Ayanna wore a dress of white doeskin decorated with turquoise and silver, while a wreath of sage and wildflowers crowned her dark hair. Josiah had traded his usual rough work clothes for a black suit sent from Santa Fe, though he kept his father's silver pocket watch, the only inheritance he'd carried west. Running Bear performed the Navajo rituals, blessing the union with prayers to the 4 directions and the sacred mountain spirits. Then Reverend Matthews, the territory circuit preacher, read from his Bible and pronounced them husband and wife under territorial law. The wedding feast brought together an unlikely group, Navajo warriors sharing roasted venison with frontier settlers, while children from both cultures played together in the golden afternoon light. Language barriers dissolved in laughter, and the universal celebration of love found and pledged. But even as they celebrated, Ayanna and Josiah knew their real work was just beginning. Their marriage was more than a union of 2 hearts. It was a bridge between worlds that had too often met in conflict. Within a month of their wedding, they had their first test. A dispute arose between Running Bear's tribe and a group of Mormon settlers over water rights to a crucial spring. Both sides had valid claims, and tensions escalated quickly toward violence. Ayana served as translator and cultural interpreter, while Josiah used his knowledge of territorial law and surveying to map out a solution. Working together, they negotiated a sharing agreement that gave both groups access to the water while establishing protocols for maintaining the delicate peace. "You see," Ayana said to her husband as they watched children from both communities playing by the disputed spring, "this is what we were meant to do." Their cabin became a meeting place for anyone seeking to resolve conflicts between cultures. Ayana taught English to young Navajo who wanted to understand the changing world, while Josiah helped settlers learn about desert survival and respectful coexistence with tribal lands. Word of their success spread, and by spring, they were receiving requests for mediation from as far as Phoenix and Flagstaff. Territorial officials, initially skeptical of the half-breed couple, began to rely on their unique abilities to maintain peace in a volatile region. But their most important collaboration was the life growing within Ayana. As summer approached, she began showing signs of pregnancy, and both of them felt the deep satisfaction of bringing new life into the world they were helping to reshape. "Our child will know no division between worlds," Ayana said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set behind the red rocks. "He will be equally at home in the pueblo and the schoolhouse. She," Josiah corrected with a grin, "will be as stubborn and beautiful as her mother." Ayana laughed, the sound carrying across the valley like music. "How do you know it will be a daughter?" "Same way I knew you were the woman from my dreams," Josiah replied, pulling her closer. "Some things a man just feels in his bones." As if responding to their conversation, Ayana felt the first flutter of movement within her womb. She guided Josiah's hand to the spot, and they both held their breath as their child announced its presence with a gentle kick. "Our bridge between worlds," Josiah whispered, wonder filling his voice. In the distance, a coyote called to the rising moon, and somewhere in the night, an owl answered. The desert that had once seemed harsh and unforgiving now felt like home to both of them. A place where love had taught them that the strongest bonds are forged not despite differences, but because of them. Their daughter was born on a night when shooting stars filled the desert sky like scattered diamonds. Running Bear declared it a sign that the child would bring light to dark places, and they named her Stella Star in the white man's language, yet carrying the same meaning as the Navajo name her grandfather whispered in her ear, Sahola. Stella grew like a wildflower in the high desert, equally comfortable speaking Navajo with her grandfather's people and English with the settlers who frequently visited their cabin. By age 5, she could read both languages and had learned to navigate the complex social dynamics of existing between two worlds. The child became a living symbol of the peace Ayana and Josiah had worked to create. When disputes arose, adults who might have reached for weapons instead found themselves considering how their actions would affect the children, particularly this bright-eyed girl who belonged equally to both communities. But their growing success attracted unwanted attention. Colonel Kinloch, transferred to a desk job in Washington after his failures in the territory, had spent 3 years nurturing his hatred and planning revenge. Using his military connections, he arranged for a new territorial governor to be appointed, one who owed Kinloch favors and shared his views on proper racial boundaries. Governor Harrison Webb arrived in the territory with orders to civilize the savage elements and restore proper social order. His first official act was to declare all mixed marriages void under territorial law and to order the removal of any children from such unions to government boarding schools. The news reached Josiah and Ayana through Running Bear, who had learned of Webb's intentions from sympathetic traders. That evening, as Stella played with her carved wooden horse by the fire, her parents discussed their options in hushed voices. "They want to take her from us," Ayanna said, her voice tight with controlled fury. Send her to one of those schools where they cut children's hair and forbid them to speak their native tongues. Over my dead body, Josiah replied, his hand instinctively moving to his gun belt. But we can't fight the territorial government directly. We need another solution. Perhaps it is time to leave, Ayanna suggested reluctantly. California doesn't have these laws. Or we could go north to Colorado. But even as she spoke, both of them knew running wasn't the answer. They had built something precious in this valley, a community where different peoples could coexist. Abandoning it would doom all the progress they had made. No, Josiah said finally. This is our home, our fight. And we're not facing it alone. He was right. Word of Webb's intentions spread quickly through both communities, and the response surprised everyone. Mormon settlers who had initially been suspicious of mixed marriages now defended them, having seen firsthand how Ayanna and Josiah's mediation had prevented bloodshed. Navajo warriors who had once distrusted all white men now spoke of Josiah as a brother. Reverend Matthews, the circuit preacher who had performed their wedding, rode into the territorial capital to challenge the governor's authority. He argued that marriages performed under God's law couldn't be dissolved by man's whim, and that the territorial government was exceeding its constitutional authority, but Webb had prepared for resistance. He arrived at the valley with a company of federal marshals and a court order, demanding the immediate surrender of all mixed-race children for proper Christian education and assimilation. As the dust cloud of approaching riders appeared on the horizon, Stella looked up from her play. Papa, why do those men look angry? Josiah knelt beside his daughter, taking her small hands in his weathered ones. Sometimes, little star, people are afraid of things they don't understand. They think love should only happen between people who look exactly the same. That's silly, Stella said with the wisdom of innocence. My heart doesn't see colors. It just sees people it likes and people it doesn't. Ayanna joined them, rapping, her arms around both husband and daughter. Remember that, my star. No matter what happens, remember that love is stronger than fear. Outside, the sound of many horses grew louder, but now it came from two directions. Webb's marshals approached from the east, but from the north came Running Bear with 50 warriors, while from the south rode every settler who had benefited from the peace Ayanna and Josiah had helped create. The final confrontation was about to begin. Governor Webb's confidence wavered as he surveyed the assembled crowd. What he had expected to be a simple enforcement action had become a standoff involving hundreds of armed men from multiple communities. His federal marshals, though well-trained, were vastly outnumbered. This is madness, Webb declared, standing in his stirrups to address the crowd. I am here under the authority of the United States government to enforce territorial law. Anyone who interferes will be charged with treason. Reverend Matthews rode forward, his Bible held high. Governor Webb, I've spent 30 years on this frontier, and I've learned something about God's law versus man's law. When the two conflict, I choose to follow the higher authority. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Even settlers who had never shown much interest in religion found themselves nodding at the preacher's words. Josiah stepped out from his cabin, carrying Stella in his arms while Ayanna walked beside him. The sight of the family, the cowboy, the Navajo woman, and their beautiful daughter crystallized what everyone was truly fighting for. Governor, Josiah called out, his voice carrying clearly across the valley, you came here to take my daughter, but look around you. See how many people are willing to stand between you and that child. Ask yourself why. Webb's face reddened. Because they've been corrupted by your unnatural union. The mixing of races leads only to chaos and the breakdown of civilized society. Chaos? Running Bear urged his horse forward, his weathered face calm despite the tension. Before my daughter married this man, our peoples fought over water, over land, over ancient grievances. Now our children play together, our families trade freely, and we settle disputes with words instead of weapons. If this is chaos, then chaos brings more peace than your civilization. One of the Mormon settlers, a gruff man named Brother Jensen, who had initially opposed the mixed marriage, spoke up. "Governor, I've got to ask, have you ever seen what real chaos looks like? Because I have. I've seen communities torn apart by hatred and fear. What we've got here is the opposite of that." Webb tried a different approach. The law is clear. Mixed marriages are invalid, and the children must be educated properly. I'm not here to debate policy, but to enforce it. "Whose law?" asked a voice from the crowd. It was Sarah Whitman, the schoolteacher from the nearest settlement. She rode forward holding a leather-bound book. "Because I've read the territorial charter, and there's nothing in it about invalidating existing marriages. What you're proposing is a new interpretation, one that violates both the Constitution and basic human rights." Webb's jaw tightened. "Young woman, you overstep your place. Legal interpretation is not a matter for schoolteachers to. I may be just a schoolteacher." Sarah interrupted, "But I can read, and I can see that your order lacks proper legal authority. No federal judge has ruled on this matter, and territorial law cannot retroactively invalidate marriages performed under religious sanction." The crowd began to murmur more loudly, sensing that the governor's authority was built on shakier ground than he'd claimed. Captain Morrison, the lead federal marshal, leaned over to speak quietly with Webb. Their conversation grew heated, with Morrison gesturing toward the assembled crowd and shaking his head repeatedly. Finally, Morrison addressed the gathering. "I've reviewed the legal documents, and there appear to be jurisdictional questions that need clarification. This matter should be resolved in federal court, not in the field." Webb's face went purple with rage. "Captain, you have your orders." "My orders were to enforce valid legal mandates," Morrison replied evenly. "But I won't start a war over a questionable interpretation of territorial authority. Not when it means firing on American citizens protecting their families." The standoff stretched on as Webb realized his position was untenable. His own marshals were questioning the legality of his orders. The local population was united against him, and he had no clear legal authority to act. Stella, who had been watching the proceedings with the intense curiosity of a child, suddenly spoke up in her clear, innocent voice. "Why don't the sad man in the fancy clothes want me to live with my mama and papa? Did I do something bad?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Here was a 5-year-old child, bright and beautiful and loved, asking why a government official wanted to tear her away from her family. The moral weight of that simple question was impossible to ignore. Even some of Webb's marshals shifted uncomfortably, several of them fathers themselves. "You haven't done anything bad, little star," Ayanna said, her voice carrying to every person present. "Some people are just afraid of what they don't understand." Webb opened his mouth for another proclamation, but found he had no words that wouldn't make him sound like a man bent on destroying a child's happiness for the sake of abstract principles. The resolution came not through violence, but through an unexpected ally. As the standoff continued into its second day, a new rider approached from the east, a well-dressed man on a fine horse, accompanied by only 2 escorts. "Judge Nathaniel Crawford," the rider announced himself as he dismounted, "Federal Circuit Judge for the Arizona and New Mexico territories. I've ridden here to resolve this matter under proper legal authority." Webb's relief was visible. "Judge Crawford, thank goodness. I've been trying to enforce territorial law, but these people—" "Governor Webb," Judge Crawford interrupted, his voice carrying the authority of decades on the federal bench, "you've exceeded your mandate. Territorial law cannot retroactively invalidate marriages performed under religious sanction without proper due process. More importantly, you have no authority to seize children from loving homes without proving abuse or neglect. The crowd held its collective breath as the judge continued. "I've spent 3 weeks investigating this situation," Crawford said. "I've spoken with territorial officials, examined legal precedents, and interviewed citizens from both communities. What I've found is a remarkable example of peaceful coexistence and mutual prosperity." He gestured toward Ayanna and Josiah. "This couple has prevented more conflicts and saved more lives than any military action in territorial history. Their marriage, far from being a threat to social order, has become a cornerstone of regional peace." Webb sputtered objections, but Crawford silenced him with a raised hand. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I've received official communications from Washington. Colonel Kinloch's involvement in orchestrating this action has been discovered. He's currently under investigation for abuse of authority and falsification of official reports. His influence on territorial policy is ended." The weight of those words settled over the assembly like a blanket of relief. Webb's face went ashen as he realized his political career was likely over. "As for the child," Judge Crawford said, walking over to where Stella stood between her parents, "I see a bright, healthy, well-loved little girl who speaks multiple languages and serves as a bridge between communities. Taking her from this environment would be not just cruel, but counterproductive to the territory's interests." Crawford knelt down to Stella's level. "Young lady, do you know what you are?" Stella considered the question seriously. "I'm my mama's daughter and my papa's little star and grandfather's joy and teacher Sarah's best student and—" She paused, thinking. "And I'm me," the judge smiled. "Exactly right. You're yourself, and that's the most important thing anyone can be." Standing, he addressed the entire gathering. "Let this be recorded in territorial law. Marriages performed under religious sanction between consenting adults are valid regardless of race or cultural background. Children of such unions are to be considered full citizens with all rights and protections thereof." A cheer went up from the crowd, Navajo war cries mixing with settler shouts of approval. Webb and his remaining supporters retreated hastily, their authority broken and their cause revealed as as the crowd began to disperse. Judge Crawford approached Josiah and Ayanna privately. "I have a proposition for you both," he said. "The territorial government needs official mediators, people who can help resolve disputes between different communities. The position comes with federal appointment and substantial authority. Interested?" Ayanna and Josiah exchanged glances. It was everything they had been doing unofficially, now with the backing of law. "We accept," Ayanna said, speaking for both of them. "Excellent. Your first assignment will be helping to establish a new territorial policy on intercultural relations. The old ways of conflict and separation have failed. It's time to try something built on understanding and cooperation." Years passed like seasons in the high desert. Stella grew into a remarkable young woman, fluent in 4 languages and skilled in both traditional Navajo arts and frontier academics. She became the first student to attend the Territorial University on a scholarship specifically created for children from mixed marriages. Their cabin evolved into a compound, part family home, part government office, part cultural center. Visitors came from across the territory seeking their mediation services, and their success rate in preventing conflicts became legendary. Running Bear lived to see his granddaughter graduate with honors and to hold his first great-grandchild, Stella's son, with a young lawyer who had come west to study their mediation techniques and stayed to marry their daughter. On an evening in autumn, as the canyon walls caught fire in the sunset, Ayanna and Josiah sat on their porch. now silvered with age but still strong in their love for each other and their shared purpose. "Do you ever regret it?" Ayanna asked, as she had many times over. "The years. The choice to build something new instead of following the old paths?" Josiah took her weathered hand in his, their fingers intertwining with the practiced ease of decades. "Only on days ending in Y," he said, making her laugh as he always did with that particular joke. "Look what we built," he continued, gesturing toward the valley where children of multiple cultures played together in the golden light, where families gathered for shared meals that blended traditions from different worlds, where the sound of laughter carried on the evening breeze. "We didn't just save each other in that desert," Ayanna said softly. "We saved something bigger than ourselves." As if summoned by their words, Stella appeared with her own children, a boy of 10 and a girl of 7, both carrying the mixed heritage that was becoming more common throughout the territory. They ran to their grandparents for the evening story, a tradition that had continued for over 20 years. "Tell us about the desert," the children chorused, settling beside their elders, and as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Ayanna began the story they all knew by heart but never tired of hearing, the tale of a woman left to die in the desert who found not just rescue, but a love that transcended all boundaries and built bridges between worlds. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and somewhere in the night, another answered. The desert that had witnessed their first meeting continued to shelter their love, their family, and the community they had created from nothing more than courage, compassion, and the radical belief that love knows no boundaries. Their legacy lived on in every dispute resolved through understanding rather than violence, in every child who grew up knowing that differences make communities stronger, and in every marriage that proved love conquers all, even in the harsh beauty of the two. American frontier, where a cowboy's whispered words to a dying woman had changed not just 2 lives, but the destiny of an entire territory. The end came not with dramatic flourish, but with the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived and a love that had grown stronger with each passing season. They had found each other in the desert, but they had found their purpose in building something beautiful from the meeting of 2 worlds, a testament to the truth that the strongest bridges are built not from steel and stone, but from understanding, respect, and love that refuses to be bound by the narrow definitions others would impose. Their story became legend throughout the territory, and beyond the tale of the native beauty left to die in the desert. And the cowboy who whispered, "You're the one I've longed for," beginning not just a great love story, but a new chapter in the ongoing story of America itself, where dreams of unity and understanding sometimes do come true under the vast, star-filled desert sky.